All right. Well, Amelia, thank you for joining us today. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what it is that you do.
Thank you for having me. My name is Amelia Tiemann. I'm currently a master's student at UC Davis in the Sacramento area, and I'm studying environmental policy and management. And that's what I do most of the time right now, but I've also been working in nuclear advocacy for the last several years, which started with working for Generation Atomic in college, like my sophomore year, and that was about 5 years ago. And now I'm basically just super into nuclear, and I'm doing everything I can to spread the message. And yeah, and I'm active on Twitter, so I
Okay.
tweet a lot
Yeah,
about nuclear stuff.
we'll come to that in a moment. So, where did you do your undergraduate?
Where?
Uh huh.
Bard College in
Okay.
upstate New York.
And how did you turn the corner to your current thing? What got you started on this path of nefarious ends that you're on right now?
The dark side. Um, uh, I guess it sort of happened spontaneously. Like I was doing environmental studies at Bard, and I was really worried about climate change and all of that, and sort of getting introduced to everything. And I think through a family connection, I actually met Eric Meyer. My mom was like working with him to organize his march in San Francisco. He organized like the first ever pro-nuclear march, as he called it, and I ended up meeting him, and so thankfully through that, I got a job with Generation Atomic, and then everything just kind of went from there. I only worked with them for like a year or so, and then I started to do like my own advocacy kind of. And then I started working for Canon Bryan at Terrestrial Energy as a research assistant. And now I'm also working with him in his new venture, which I'm not sure how much I can talk about that, but
Yeah, no problem. So, when you were like with your concerns about the environment, were you always interested in nuclear energy, or was it something that you discovered late? In your later than maybe you would have originally thought?
I have to admit something, which is that I pretty much literally had no awareness nuclear energy existed until college
Uh huh.
at all. Like, did not know what it was. I knew the word nuclear and that it applied to weapons, and that's as far as it went. And then as soon as somebody told me about it in a pro-nuclear way, which was Eric, I was like, wait, why haven't I heard of this? Why
Uh huh.
aren't we using it everywhere? And so I never really had like a being converted moment. It's sort of just I always liked it.
Do you think that's pretty typical of um, I guess new college entrants, that most people haven't heard about it and so they don't know what opinion to have, or do you think most people
Um,
have already an opinion coming in?
I don't know. I think I think probably a fairly good amount of people know about it or have at least heard the word Chernobyl or something like that, or nuclear weapons, and have that immediate association. And that's as far as it goes. And to no fault of their own, that's kind of our society's doing. But I think a lot of people are easily, like in terms of people in my age group, like grad students or when I was a college student, they are pretty amenable. They're just not really that well informed, but I think that's changing.
Hmm.
I think a lot more people, if you ask them, you ask like mid-20s people now, they're probably like, oh, nuclear, yeah, we need that.
Okay, was this in your experience with other students? Have they also been generally receptive, or have you had some with a lot of pushback, or like what's been? Um,
Um, yeah, this is actually a topic that I really like talking about because I think people, especially students in the younger generation, are, first of all, they're going to be the most important constituents in moving nuclear policy forward in the future. And I think they're the most receptive because they didn't really live through like the Cold War or, eras of the past where people had air raid drills. And so now people are like more worried about climate change. And I think if you have a 10-minute conversation with the average college student, they're likely to come out of that being pro-nuclear, at least in my experience, which I think is cool.
So were there any opportunities at your undergraduate institution to talk about this, or has this all been outside of the academic environment where you've made your voice heard?
It wasn't really, like, nuclear power wasn't mentioned in my course curriculum at all in undergrad.
Was climate change something that came up a lot?
Definitely, yeah. My coursework had to do with climate change, it had to do with ecology. There was, talk about renewable energy. But I do remember asking a question in class once about nuclear and kind of getting shut down. And that was the end of that.
By the professor?
Yeah.
What was that like? Was it the professor? Yeah. What was why did it get shut down? And yeah, let's start with that. Do you know why?
She personally was just anti-nuclear for one. I think she brought up some expert and was like, why don't you ask them what they think, and they'll tell you more about it than I can. And that was the end of that.
Okay.
She just didn't want to hear it. But she ended up becoming my thesis advisor, and I wrote about nuclear, which was pretty funny. And
but it was mostly, do you think that it was mostly that she didn't know enough about it to have as strong an opinion as was actually held, or?
I think that's likely. She's a brilliant economics professor, and I don't think it has to do with, I don't think it's really people's fault, so I kind of feel bad saying that in a sense. I do think that during the process of me writing the thesis, she kind of came around more. But she sort of maintained this position as like, I'm strictly your advisor and I'm going to make sure you do a rigorous job on this paper. And then by the end of it, she was like, you know what, like,
maybe I should look at this again. Yeah. Well, and that's, I think it's fair to say that that's not uncommon in academia. I mean, academics often get a bad rap for not being open-minded because, I mean, there's hundreds of colleges across the United States, and so there's thousands of faculty. It's not hard to find the 1 in 1,000 that's like the most extreme and egregious and ideologically bent, where you can have giving advice to someone, you don't necessarily have to agree with the position that they're taking to be able to give good advice. And I think most faculty are probably like that anyways.
Yeah, exactly, which I appreciate.
So then so I found that a lot of students also are pretty open to it, but my interaction with students is primarily through the engineering. Engineers are generally open to, let's talk about, ways to build power plants that do this, that, or the other. So engineers and physicists might not be a cross section of the student body that would be looking at something like this. So with your other students, was it that the majority of the other students just didn't know, and there might have been a small minority that had an opinion one way or the other?
Do you more mean now in this master's degree or back in?
Back as an undergraduate, and then we'll.
I would say majority didn't really know, and some were like, well, what about waste? What about Chernobyl? So people had some general background about that. But I don't think I really met anyone that was like an extremist. Yeah, okay. I think it's just.
And then as you transition from undergraduate to the graduate program, did you have much time off, or did you go straight from undergraduate to graduate?
Yeah, I took time off. I did, well, like COVID hit like um, the year that I graduated. So
Okay, a
I
good
pretty
time to take
much
time off.
hung out for 2 years and then started applying to grad school. But I had a good 2 years off.
Hmm. And your experience in grad school, how does that compare to undergraduate in terms of, well, like what are you doing right now in graduate school, and how does it relate to what you had? And then we'll go into some other details.
Right now, I'm just wrapping up the first year, and then there's one more year. And next year, I guess I'm choosing my specialization. So I think mine's going to be energy and transportation
Hmm.
policy, because that most closely aligns with what I want to do. And we've had like core classes this year mostly
Hmm.
and electives, and next year we have a policy clinic. So, all that boring stuff.
Uh-huh.
But I think we don't really have a capstone. We have a like professional based program. So we have to do a practicum, which is basically somewhat
Working.
like an internship.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And what has been your experience regarding, nuclear energy and its discussion in these classes compared to your undergraduate?
I would say better. I was that person that brought up nuclear like in one of our classes in the first quarter. And I was like, yeah, I was wondering if we could talk about this, like if anyone is open. And people actually seemed like surprised in a good way. And some people came up to me and were like, yeah, I was always wondering about nuclear. I just don't know anything about it. But now that you were talking about it, it seems really cool.
Hmm.
And we had a debate in class, and one of the topics was, should we transition to nuclear? So I kind of decided to be on that team so that I could, one, like practice my skills talking about it,
Uh-huh.
but also see what people's reaction would be, because I'm just morbidly curious in that way. And people seemed like really receptive. So,
Hmm. So,
yeah.
with the, so you said that you did some work with Generation Atomic. Can you tell me what this organization is and what you did for it?
Oh, yeah. So it's run by Eric Meyer. He's based in Minnesota. And at the time, um, I was just doing canvassing, like door to door. So we started in Pittsburgh, PA, and we were literally just going door to door, talking to people about the nuclear plants nearby in
Hmm.
their neighborhood that were slated to close early. Um, we went to Ohio once, and we went to a county fair with a booth and just talked to people about nuclear, like the Davis-Besse plant.
Hmm.
Um,
And
So
how
yeah, it was
how did the public respond to that?
um, I think it was kind of split. Like I remember some really good conversations with people at their door. I also remember people yelling at me to leave because they didn't want to hear about it.
Hmm.
So it's split.
Did you find that if you compare the general public to the student body at your undergraduate institution, how did they
Mhm.
compare in,
In
like, I
terms
guess,
of opinion,
receptiveness?
um, I don't know if I would have a clear answer on that. I would say it's kind of similar. It might just be that I'm more informed now than when I was in college, so I'm having more conversations.
Hmm.
So I feel like people are more receptive, but I can't really say either way.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So you did Generation Atomic. There was a question that came up, which was, uh, does Generation Atomic only work on nuclear energy advocacy, or do they have other things that they work on?
Yes, they are only nuclear advocacy.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, they do a lot.
Okay. And is
Um,
it mostly geared to around plant closures and things like that, or you mentioned this march in San Francisco or in California?
yeah,
Was it in San Francisco?
yeah.
Okay.
I might be wrong, but that was, I think, 2016. I could
Hmm.
be wrong. Um, Honestly, I'm not really keeping up that much with what they're doing. But I think they've grown a lot and they have like more employees,
Hmm.
and they're able to raise funding. So
Okay.
yeah, yeah, I don't really know anymore.
So with the, have you been covered? Have you been like had interviews with media people, or has the coverage of your events been different if you were there versus if you just watched it on the news?
You mean back when I was with Generation Atomic?
Yeah. Did you
Uh,
notice a difference in the, I guess the reality of what your interactions were like at the location compared to how it was portrayed, or was the media coverage of your events fairly consistent with what you experienced?
um, I don't remember there being media coverage of what we did. I mean, there might have been some from the march.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I think, but it was really small at the time I started out. Like it was literally just me and like 3 or 4 other
Uh-huh.
canvassers. So I don't really know.
Okay. And now, what is the majority of your focus now? I guess separate from your graduate school work,
Um, well,
or are
one
they both
is
the same now? Are you like kind of doing them simultaneously and trying to mix them as much as possible?
basically that's a good way to describe it. I'm kind of trying to take as much as I can from grad school, um, from other topics that aren't nuclear to have a rounded out knowledge, and
Mm-hmm.
also because it's a requirement. But like I'm writing blogs for the fourth generation blog,
Mm-hmm.
which is curated by Cannon from Terrestrial Energy.
Okay.
Been doing that for about 3 or 4 years.
O-
Um,
Okay. Why don't you describe what is terrestrial energy and what is this blog, so that the people, people watching and myself can know what we'd be looking for when if we were to dive into that.
yeah, of course. Terrestrial is a Canadian nuclear company, and they're working on a Generation 4 nuclear reactor.
Mm-hmm.
It's a small IMSR, so integral molten salt reactor, and they are, I think, in pre-licensing stage, or they're still trying to get their permit basically to deliver their plant and to get a site. Siting is a really big issue for like
Everything.
small modular, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, that's what they're doing. And um, yeah, so Cannon is the CFO, and he started the fourth generation blog, which is basically just curates a lot of different blogs and perspectives from different industry people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool. It's like it's very like open-ended and free-flowing, but it's also got a lot of science in there and expert perspectives. And for me, I kind of offer more of like a student perspective, or I don't know, like younger generation
Mm-hmm.
perspective. Um, yeah.
So as you've developed from being a student and now as a graduate student, what have been the things that were most surprising that you learned?
Um, can you narrow it down a bit?
So, um, was there anything specifically where your mind had almost a total reversal from maybe what you thought beforehand and what you realized was true afterwards?
Um, um, it's an interesting question. I guess maybe beforehand I kind of thought that people were a little bit more entrenched in their own views, like a little bit less likely to change their views, and that it was deep rooted.
Mm-hmm.
And while that's true in some cases, I think in way more cases it's not true, and people just they need to have someone communicate with them in the right way and in order to change their views
Mm-hmm.
about any issue. And like obviously we see with polarization in America, like we have a big communication problem.
Uh-huh.
So I think the same applies to nuclear.
So what you're saying is one of the things that surprised you was that maybe humans are a more positive creature than you may have thought going in. That human
Maybe.
nature.
I used to think people were just like the way they are, basically.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if there's a good way to describe that, but like if someone was anti-nuclear, it was just because they were, and it was just because that aligned with how their mind operates. And I don't think that's a really healthy position that I held.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it was subconscious, but now I'm kind of convinced that anyone can be swayed of anything at any time, even the most extreme people. But I don't know if it's always best to focus on them. But I do think a lot of people they just need the right communication. So science communication is something that I'm really interested in getting into, because nuclear doesn't have the best PR right now.
Yeah. Have you found any specific arguments or specific facts that tend to stick out as mind-changing more than others?
You're asking all the tough questions today.
Well, the tough is interesting, right? That's
in regards to nuclear, I guess there's certain things that I find convince people the most. I think the whole analogy with your entire life's waste could fit into a soda can is pretty compelling to a lot of people who might have this image in their mind of giant fields of just toxic waste as a big issue. And while waste is its own issue that needs to be addressed, it's not nearly as much of a problem as people say. And in fact, it's the only contained waste from any industry, or that's fully contained, or from any energy industry. Obviously from fossil fuels, the waste goes up in the sky, and it's causing climate change. And we have a way to contain nuclear waste. Yes, we do need to find long-term solutions. But anyway, to bring it back, I would say just giving people like a way to visualize these different issues is very compelling. And also the gummy bear uranium pellet thing, with like a gummy bear sized amount of uranium is the same as 1 ton of coal. That's compelling to people too.
Okay, so I haven't been using gummy bear. I've been using Tootsie Rolls. Maybe
Tootsie Roll.
Maybe a gummy bear go over better. So
I don't know.
Yeah, with that, with the waste, that's actually one thing that I have my students calculate.
Really?
Excuse me. Is the amount of hold on one second.
No worries.
Okay. I have them calculate the number of train cars filled with coal that they will use in their life, and compare that to the amount of nuclear fuel that they would that they would use during their life, and you get something like 1,000 train cars worth of coal per person, and so it's a pretty big number. And then with nuclear energy, it's the worst case scenario is it's a 2-liter bottle. And if you use it more efficiently, if you use a Generation 4 nuclear reactor, then it can be a lot even smaller than that.
Exactly.
And so,
I hadn't heard that particular one. I'm going to use that now.
So I can, if you connect with me afterwards, I can actually give you the numbers that I use to calculate it, so you can run through it yourself and verify that you're not saying anything that's false. But I've done that one. Another one that I recently did was showing the land use for different energy sources. So if you and basically this is something that you can do. I did it with a number of school teachers as like, here's an example of something that you can try. Is so Las Vegas needs roughly 10 gigawatts of electricity at peak demand in the summer. And so what does it take to supply 10 gigawatts of electricity using a natural gas power plant, or using a nuclear power plant, or using solar energy? And so we have, you just take the map and you scroll there's a natural gas power plant that's fairly easy to locate in Las Vegas, and it supplies 1 gigawatt basically. And so you copy 10 of those, and then you scroll down to in Arizona is the Palo Verde plant that's about 3 1/3 gigawatts. And so you make 3 copies of that, and you have it, just keep it on the map at the same scale, and you can see, oh, here's how much of a footprint it makes to supply these different sources of energy. And then if you look at the footprint that it takes to do solar energy, then it covers the whole map.
Right.
And people, they often don't appreciate the difference, for example, between the nameplate capacity. It says that it can be 1 gigawatt of solar energy, but then you have to reduce it by all the factors that go into the actual production that you get. If the sun was beating down straight down on the equator, then you would get this amount. But when you account for the angle of the sun and the day-night cycle and things like this, then the actual real energy that you get from it is about, maybe a quarter at best for something like this. And so, I always reassure people, like, I'm not saying that we should get rid of these things. I'm just saying that you need to be aware of what it is that you're advocating for if you're advocating a transition to this.
Absolutely. And they have a place, I believe, geographically, for one. Like, you can put them in the right place that's most suitable for them, but you can't really put them everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And you definitely can't. It's hard to even power one city on one solar farm or one wind farm. You can't really do it. It's not really done anywhere.
So the amount of nuclear waste as one thing. Is there another example of something that where people say, "Wow, I didn't realize that this was the case"?
I think people don't realize that there's been virtually no deaths from nuclear ever. There's been none in the U.S. The only deaths directly from nuclear radiation from a power plant have been from Chernobyl. And even that, the estimates range from the most conservative, like 30, and the most, like 200 from the different, I think, like the WHO and different estimates. But yeah, people don't really believe, like, when you say there's 0 deaths from nuclear ever in the US, like, they're like, what? And I understand that, like, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. But yeah, like, when you think of hundreds of thousands of deaths or premature deaths from pollution from coal, and other energy sources, like, all our fossil fuels, I think it kind of really puts it in perspective for people. So, the big one.
So that is another one that has come up quite a bit in my discussions, is looking at the part of the reason, or I guess one of the downsides of the safety record of nuclear is that it means that every safety incident is a worldwide headline for a decade. Like, we're going to ignore the largest earthquake that's ever happened in recorded history and the tsunami that came from it and the people that died in the flood, and we're going to focus on this one disaster that's scarier than that. Despite the fact that tsunamis, there were 20,000 people that died from the tsunami. And in 2004, there were 200,000 people that died from that tsunami. And you compare that to... that got overlooked because, having a nuclear reactor explode, or like have an explosion at a nuclear reactor plant, even though it's a steam explosion and not a nuclear explosion, there's a lot of things that are just kind of lost. Have you had much opportunity to speak with people in the media?
Not really.
Or it's mostly been just citizen advocacy?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really do, like, formal lobbying or advocacy, at least not right now. I might get into that, but not really. My thing is more social media right now.
And how has that, how have you been received on the social media platforms for your position? Is it a toxic position, or is it...
Yeah, Twitter can be really toxic. I mean, I haven't really experienced too much of that. There's the occasional person being like, "Why are you a troll?" And, you should really fix your brain if you think that nuclear is like good at all. But I don't really care that much. And I love how much receptiveness there is amongst people who agree with me. I think that's always a great thing. And it's hard for me to see people like actively progress and change their minds through social media. It's not like a great lens for that. But I like to believe that people are out there reading things,
Uh-huh.
changing their mind. But I mostly just enjoy it. And I enjoy the challenge of like, okay, maybe I can use a tweet to convey a message that I want to say and see what people think.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So when you're doing these things, have you found what are the kinds of messages that actually get the most engagement on it? Most of your stuff has been through Twitter. Is this true?
Well, I do tweet, but I guess most of I mean, it's different. Like I do the blogging, so that's more of like
Okay.
what I would call like my work.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like my engagement with the public is definitely Twitter.
Uh-huh. And what are the kinds of things that tend to get the most traction for you?
Um, It'll be when I say something like, you know, uh, I tweeted something that was like, "Oh, nuclear, isn't that unsafe?" Well, actually, here's the track record, and then I just linked a graph showing deaths from different energy sources,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously there's the big bars with the fossil fuels, and the nuclear is like this.
Uh-huh.
People seem to like that one, and I just try to do anything that might like spread, and all I want is someone to see it and be like, "Wait, what? Like that's not what I thought before," and then maybe I'll do further research. I'm not claiming to be some Twitter celebrity like by any means,
Uh-huh.
and
Not yet.
no, but I want to put the message out there. I kind of think like if I just put something out there, like it'll be received by someone eventually who needs to see it.
Mm-hmm. So with your, let's go back to now what you're working on with your education. So describe what your plans are with your current course of study. What are you trying to mix together to craft your education in graduate school?
I'm trying to take as many energy courses as I can. I'm taking a good one called Energy Systems and kind of learning about I'm going more in depth on global energy systems and talking about demand and, like end use consumption, how much is rejected energy and gigawatts and learning all those the different ways of calculating energy, which I've always found hard. I'm not a mathematician at all. But I do want to fill that in. So I'm glad I can take that class. I'm also taking like policy courses, taking one environmental justice course at the moment. So I just want to have a lot of things to consider when I go into whatever career I'm going to do, which I still don't know what that is.
So with, for example, when you mentioned the, okay, hold on a second. I got to remember the words that you used. So you have the current source. Oh, for future demand. What is it that you that is covered in a class in terms of the future demand? Because one of the complaints that I have often with people who propose solutions to climate issues today is that they often limit themselves to you can supply the current electricity demands with this setup. It's like it tends to be the ones that I've seen, and maybe I get not a representative fraction, but the ones that I've seen have focused on here's what we could do to meet today's demand, and not necessarily here's what we can do to meet the demand at the end of the century.
Right.
So is this something that is covered in your book or in your classes? And if so, how is it covered?
I think in this particular energy course, we have been talking about future demand, where like, yeah, it's this this is going to double by 2050 and we have to do something about it. But like he showed a graph where it was like, okay, here's demand to 2050 and then nuclear demand is going to stay like this and solar demand is going to go like this huge mountain.
Uh-huh.
So some graphs like that, it seems sort of nonsensical, especially if you're an expert in these things, I would say. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I'm sure to experts that I interact with, it seems nonsensical.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like there's an over representation of renewables and how they're going to meet demand. But like in some classes, yeah, I guess it's been like, oh, how are we going to transition? So like basically assuming that what we use now is static and we're just trying to transition it over to solar or something.
Mm-hmm. So part of your work you mentioned is looking at basically nuclear and transportation. Can you go into more detail about what it is that you're exploring in that regard?
Oh, well, the specialization that's being offered is energy and transportation.
Oh, energy and transportation. Okay.
Yeah, but I am interested in transportation too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in synthetic fuels and electrification. And obviously, if you want to do all electric transportation, you need an all clean grid if you're talking about net zero.
Mm-hmm.
But I think syn fuels that are manufactured using a advanced nuclear heat source to make the syn fuels,
mm-hmm.
that's totally carbon neutral. And I think that's a hugely exciting area that I hear more people talking about even. So
mm-hmm.
just in that. I'm not sure how much this particular course curriculum is going to go into that, but I don't really care because I can learn about it anyway.
Uh-huh. So with this one, so in this case, what you're saying is you still would have a liquid fuel because there's advantages to liquid fuel in that it's easier to transport, it's easier to fit
Right.
into a gas tank that fits behind the seat of a car. And so by making a liquid fuel without burning methane so what usually happens, if I understand correctly, is that you have to do chemistry at high temperatures. And so most of the production is going to be at some high temperature that you need to supply either a natural gas burner or some kind of burner to do that. And those are usually fossil fuels. And so this would be using heat from a nuclear reactor to supply that energy. What are the types of nuclear reactors that do that? What are the temperature ranges that are necessary to do the synthetic fuel?
I believe it's over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which or is it Celsius? Oh, honestly, I don't remember, but it's 1,000 degrees something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got to get really hot, and that's only a temperature that's achievable with either fossil fuels, which are extremely energy dense, or advanced nuclear, or even nuclear that we have today. But I think you would use advanced nuclear for that purpose. But you definitely can't use an intermittent source of energy because that's extremely high temperature heat and we use that now for manufacturing and in a lot of different industries. So yeah.
So green liquid fuels, what are the feedstocks? What actually goes into making the synthetic fuels?
Well, what I know now is that you can make hydrogen-based ones. So you basically take hydrogen from the ocean and you just put them together. You can do like electrolysis with, and yeah, you use a heat source and you just do like, I mean, I'm not enough of an expert about this to tell you like the exact chemistry, but yeah, you need like hydrogen and carbon and you just put them together and you make a fuel that's basically identical to petroleum or to fuels we use today, except that the reason it's carbon neutral is because when you burn it, you're basically emitting, but you're emitting something that you already took out. So it's like carbon neutral.
So you're not pulling something out of the ground and putting that carbon into the air. You're taking something that's at the surface already, that's already carbon at the surface, and that would also go back into the surface.
you would use like CCS to use carbon and then have it be like a full cycle thing. And so people already do that with people already make hydrogen fuel cells, which would be like a synthetic fuel, except they're manufactured using fossil fuels. So the manufacture of it is the problem, and that's why fuel cells aren't necessarily clean, or hydrogen fuels aren't necessarily clean. It's more about the energy input to make them.
Okay. Now, this was a question that came up. What is CCS?
Oh, carbon capture and storage.
Okay. And how does that work?
It can work a lot of different ways. It basically just means that you're taking carbon that's in the atmosphere and you're sequestering it so that it's not in the atmosphere. Whether that means you use some technology to capture CO2 from the sky, and you can make it into a lump of carbon, or you can make it into a diamond. There's a company called Ether Diamonds that's doing exactly that. Like, they literally just take CO2 from the sky and make it into a diamond. Just like a molecule with a lot of carbon in it. And the reason that's helpful is that it's now in solid form and it's not being a greenhouse gas that's trapping heat in the atmosphere. So carbon capture on a large scale would look like a giant machine, basically, that's just getting the carbon out of the atmosphere. And there's a lot of different technologies for that, which I don't have enough of a background to explain. But I would say it's an emerging field right now.
So in your cohort of students, how many of them are looking at nuclear energy as, I guess, a central part of their education? And what are the other members of your cohort, like your classmates, what are they looking at for how are they going to save the world?
A lot of people are looking into jobs in the public sector, like, for example, working for California Air Resources Board or something like that, or for working for the water regulator. I think a lot of people are interested in ecology, but there are some people interested in energy. There's also an energy graduate group, which I'm not a part of for some reason. I applied to a different program. But in my particular cohort, people are doing a lot of different things. My friend Erin is a lobbyist at Union of Concerned Scientists. So she works at the Capitol. So people have different backgrounds, and a lot of them are already kind of in their professional careers. But there's a lot of, this is a policy program, so interest in policy.
Okay. So let's turn to policy then. So in terms of in general, the policies, the way that they're written, how would you rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 with, in terms of like the quality, or do they actually accomplish what they're looking for? What's your overall assessment of the way that energy policy, is it energy policy specifically that you're looking at?
Oh God, kind of. How would I rate the energy policy? What do you want to keep it to California?
Yeah, let's start with California. So for an outside observer like me looks at California and says it's probably a basket case. So can you disabuse me of this preconceived notion?
Oh God, probably not. Well, we have SB 100, which is the clean energy standard bill, but it's basically let me just look it up real quick so I don't say anything wrong. It's basically our renewable portfolio standard program, and it's requiring a certain percentage of utilities to generate a certain percentage of their energy from renewables, and then later on it's going to be from all energy sources.
And how's that working?
Oh gosh. Well, not great, because we have one nuclear plant right now, Diablo Canyon, and that's generating about 10% of our energy in California. It's pretty freaking impressive. That says a lot about nuclear density. and it's being shut down in 2024. So once that happens, we're losing 10% of our energy that's completely clean. So I would say that's kind of going backwards from our goals.
What fraction? So it's 10% of your total energy that's clean. What fraction of clean energy is Diablo Canyon?
Think about.
Is it like half? A quarter?
Let me just pull up a pie chart for you. Wait, that's US. Yeah, so percent of clean energy. Yeah, I think it's like a quarter.
So 10% of total electricity generation and a quarter of the green electricity generation. And they want to replace 100%. Is it 100% or is it 50%? 100% Clean Energy Act is what it says by 2045.
Right. Yeah, that's what it is. 100% clean energy. It's 100% clean energy target by 2045, and that's carbon free.
60% by 2030.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for reminding me. So it's 60% renewables by 2030, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So like things that fall into renewables. So that would be solar, wind, basically what we consider renewable. Right now, I think like biomass is considered renewable, but that's a whole other issue.
That sounds dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, because it sounds dangerous because trees don't grow that fast.
Yeah.
And California is a desert.
Yeah. Yeah, we also make like corn ethanol as biomass, and it's dirty. Like just because we can regrow corn doesn't mean we aren't emitting when we burn it. So we're basically emitting.
Because with corn, you're going to have all the fertilizer that goes along with it, and that's fertilizer production's like 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions is fertilizer production.
Really? Oh my God.
Yeah. So because fertilizer, the highest emitting industries, I think, it's just the nature of the high temperature chemistry and also the physical process of producing it is steel production, cement production, and fertilizer production.
Right.
And so.
Yeah, so you need even more industry just to make some fuel or just to make some stuff that you can burn and turn into electricity. It doesn't really make sense.
So with what else have you seen? Are you focusing specifically on California policy, or are you looking at national policy with your, I guess, either right now or in the future?
In the future, I don't really know what's to come. And this program has focused a lot on California policy. I guess not really so much in energy policy, which explains why I'm so iffy to say the right thing, because at the top of my head, it's really hard for me to remember. But I guess I'm personally interested in looking at things at a national level and even international, because the state of the nuclear industry varies from country to country. Some countries embrace it, some absolutely don't. So whatever sort of field I get into in this, I know I want to work on nuclear. I just don't really know where I can have the most impact, but wherever I can, that will be great.
So when you talk with the other students, what is their view about, do you talk with them much about California's energy policy, or is it mostly about the environmental policies?
I guess I've talked with people about a lot of different policies. It's like people have different passions, and some want to talk about water, and some want to talk about farmers. Some want to talk about, fires, like wildfires and restoration. So there's so much going on. Like California is kind of suffering from a lot of different things right now. So people are I'm glad to see that people are well-rounded, basically.
Okay, trying to address some of everything. With
Yeah.
their experience looking at these things, does it seem to them that the policies are well informed? Because one of the things that comes up a lot is this interplay between, we don't want to have any lobbyists involved in politics,
Right.
but then you end up with people who aren't informed. So like there's two camps and they compete with each other, and it's not necessarily, it's probably a good competition in the end because there's got to be some balance that gets struck. But on the one
Right.
hand, if you're totally beholden to lobbyists, then you're not an independent thinker anymore. But if you don't listen to lobbyists at all, then it's not obvious that, because these are people who specialize on it. And so
Right.
have you seen, I guess, what's your position on the interplay between too much lobbyist influence versus not enough lobbyist influence?
I think a lot of people would have a more expert opinion than I do on that, but I think lobbyists do get a bad rap, and they are important. It also depends like how you define a lobbyist. So lobbyist can be anyone that goes into a legislator's office and sits down with someone and says, look, I think this is an important issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to keep coming back and I'm going to keep talking
Keep
about it
bothering
until
you.
someone listens to me. Yeah. Or they can also work for an established lobbying organization like Union of Concerned Scientists or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they do good. I mean, they lobby. Lobbying just means that you're talking about an issue and you're trying to get bills, and you're trying to show up at hearings and get bills to pass on different committees and keep going and eventually become law.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously there's lobbyists that are up to no good, but
Mm-hmm.
I do think they get more of a bad rep than they should.
Okay. And what about the politicians themselves? Do you think that they get a bad rap? Or have they been, what's your experience been on that front? Or do they deserve it?
I would have to ask my friends who are more involved in policy making themselves. I think probably some politicians don't deserve it and some do.
Mm-hmm.
And politicians essentially don't necessarily know about every issue. They kind of are beholden to their constituents and what they want. So if enough people come forward and say, we want this reform, obviously the politician wants to get reelected, so they might look into it,
Mm-hmm.
probably try to do it. So a lot of politicians basically operate on wanting to get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of members in Congress and state Congress, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at some of these policies with California, have you found the policies to be pretty well informed in those areas where you know enough to make a judgment? Have you found them to be fairly well informed, or have you found them to be missing pieces of information that?
I think some can be. I would say a lot of, like, I'm friends with one girl in my cohort who's a lobbyist, and she's extremely well informed about things. She's got a giant spreadsheet of every bill, its implications, what it would do, when it needs to pass. And so there's people out there working in the Capitol who know everything, and they have all these connections and they know who to talk to. And then sometimes things just don't pass. Sometimes a bill just dies in a hearing, even if it was going to do amazing work. It just happens. It's just about like what key constituents are there kind of trying to shoot it down. Like if you have a lot of citizen organizations that show up and try to kill a bill, then it might not pass even if it would have done something really good. So things just like the level of well-informed it is doesn't always have to do with how much
traction it's going to get.
Yeah. But I think like energy policy in California is a little bit screwed, especially since we're closing a nuclear plant. I mean, I always go back to that because it makes me so mad. But we're closing a nuclear plant that does not need to be closed. Like that thing could keep chugging along for decades.
Mm-hmm.
But that has to do with kind of broken policies that are causing it to be uneconomical. And then that goes back into energy markets and subsidies that are favoring solar and wind, even though those sources are variable. So it's hard to have a grid that's so heavily dependent on solar and wind, because at certain levels, like if you reach a certain amount of solar that's feeding into the electricity grid, at some point it's going to become more costly to people because it's harder to run a grid on so much solar that's so intermittent. And then you need to also build like natural gas, which we have a lot of in California because we have so much solar that needs.
So this is
backup.
In this case you're talking about the duct graph where solar is at its peak, your baseline, the peak solar sets your baseline for everything else in the grid. And then when the sun starts to set, but the demand continues to rise, then you have this really steep rise in the amount of electricity you have to provide from something that's not solar.
Basically,
and the only thing that can do that is a jet engine that's out in the parking lot somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Or like a coal plant, depending on where you are. Like it's kind of inconvenient because as soon as the sun starts going down, that's when people get home from work and start turning on their lights, so they start using more electricity. So you're right, the graph like looks like a duck because in the middle of the day there's the least demand and then it goes up. And then that's where the base load generation has to come in to back it up. So basically I really think California energy policy is messed up because we have so much gas, and that's to help us out with our solar. But then our solar, we literally have to like ship it over to Nevada or something to use it because we can't use all of it during the day. Like people don't need it, and we don't have enough storage. Like battery storage technology hasn't come far enough to where we can store it for when we actually start needing it in those other hours of the day. So it's a huge problem that we have to deal with. And that's not to say I don't think solar doesn't have a place at all. I think it does. But we can't also be shutting our nuclear plants. We can't have policies that favor solar so much that the costs of solar start being transferred to lower income households that don't have solar panels. That has to do with residential solar. So it's a little
So
different,
what you're saying is that I shouldn't have my neighbor subsidize my solar panel so that I can feel good about myself? Is that?
Yeah, kind of. Well, that has to do with like the NEM bill, which is currently like a hot button issue. And it's basically talking about whether there should be a cut to solar subsidies so that people don't have to bear the brunt of other people not paying, is what it really comes down to. So there's so many issues. It's so complex. Like it's endlessly complex.
So as a final question, because I know you've got to run, who are the people who are doing, in your view, affecting the most positive change in this direction? And what are the messages that they're sending out that someone like me, for example, might be able to help with? So who are the people, and what is it that they're saying that's really making a change at the policy level and at the public opinion level?
Absolutely. I would say Isabel Boamek. I don't know if you've heard about her, but she's basically calls herself the first nuclear influencer, which I think is really cool. She organized a rally at Diablo Canyon back in, I think it was November or December. And she got like hundreds of people to show up. She got members of Congress to show up. And they talked about why they believe they should keep the plant open. And she's amazing. She's amassed a huge following. She started out as a model in Brazil, and now she decided that nuclear is just her calling, and she just wants to talk about why it's great. And she just decided to learn the science for herself. And she's endlessly inspiring to me. So she's doing great work. She puts out a lot of really positive messaging on Twitter, a lot of like fun pictures and graphics. So that's a great person to follow. I don't know if you want me to like give your people's handles.
Yeah, that would Might as well.
So she's Isodope, Isodope. Actually, sorry, it's I_SODOPE. And then she also has a personal Twitter account, which I think is more active. So she's Isabel, ISABELLE
Okay, let me see if I can get that up so I can copy it. There it is. All right, I'll put that into the chat.
Okay.
Okay.
Another person is Thies Beckers. He's in the Netherlands, and he does amazing work too. I think he also has a YouTube channel. Let me just pull it up. His YouTube channel is The Nuclear Humanist, and he talks a lot about nuclear going on, I think a lot in Europe, but he's got an amazing science background, and he's also done advocacy too. And I think he single-handedly got the Netherlands to talk about building some more nuclear plants.
Mm-hmm.
He was in there with legislators in the Netherlands.
Yeah, one thing that I found interesting is how Europe has kind of split itself on nuclear energy, with Germany, I guess, in my opinion, kind of regressing back a century, and other places in Europe being like, oh, we got to go more in this direction. I mean, France basically declared, no, we're not changing what we're doing. We actually like our cheap electricity.
Their energy independence.
Mm-hmm. So a question from chat is are the historical players still active today? So he brings up Al Gore. So back in the day, Al Gore was really influential with some of the things that he did. Is this someone that people still pay attention to, or is he on Facebook?
That's a really good question. I don't know what Al Gore is up to.
I guess that kind of answers that question. So he's still on Facebook and MySpace, and the rest of the world has moved on.
MySpace? Oh my God. Doesn't that not work anymore?
I don't know. I haven't tried.
Well, I mean, I know he was kind of like a founder of the climate movement, at least.
The recent one?
Yeah, the recent one. Or at least part of getting climate change to be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of maybe it can be considered a past era of the original, the OG climate change people. But I don't really honestly know what his views are now. I know he's not really pro-nuclear or anything.
So he's not in the current generation, and to some extent, I agree with you in that when I teach my physics classes, one of the first classes that I teach is I outline. I use this as an example. I have it around here somewhere. Right here. So this is a 58-cent can of corn, and I go into all of the physics and engineering that goes into producing a 58-cent can of corn and delivering it to a big, gigantic refrigerated box in the middle of the Mojave Desert, where I can go in and stick a piece of plastic into a slot and walk out, and nobody asks me any questions about how I got this 58-cent can of corn. And so I bring up, there's a lot of problems that people have had to solve in the past, and there are downsides to anything that humans do. But the fact that you can walk into a store and fill up a gigantic basket with thousands of calories worth of food and walk out, and you don't even have to say hi to anybody. You don't have to look anybody in the eye. All this can take place. Is a testament at least to wanting to take a second thought before you start tearing things apart. And then I say, it does leave a number of other consequences. So I'll go to the Our World in Data site and I'll show them how infectious diseases have declined, maybe the last 2 years notwithstanding, but in general, infectious diseases have declined, and people aren't dying from a variety of different poisonings and things like that. And so there is a downside, and the downside is that it takes energy to provide this, and that's where we're getting climate change from. And then I lay it on them, since most of the people are engineers, the world needs you. It's your responsibility to solve this problem, and you're going to leave another set of problems in your wake for other people to deal with. But it's your generation that's going to address climate change more than any other. And so in that regard, I think outreach to college students, because I think in many cases people can be kind of nihilistic and be like, it doesn't really matter what I'm going to do. I'm not going to have kids. I'm going to do this and that and the other because, we're all going to die. Or you can say, hey, there are solutions out there to be found, but it's going to take you investing, your careers into finding and implementing those solutions. And so I think that can be a positive message for people to hear. Especially if they're going to be an engineer and want to have, how am I going to devote my life to this?
How is my work going to be relevant? Wow, I want to take your class.
You're welcome to come down. Anyways, but I really appreciate your time. Do you have any other last comments? So where can people find you and what your work is? And if you have any closing comments that you'd like to share with us, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, honestly, there was so much stuff that popped up in my mind with what you just said. But yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's hard for people. I mean, these issues are existential, right? It's stressful and anxiety inducing, and I've had many sleepless nights over climate change. And now I just try to avoid that as much as I can and just try to be inspired I might seem like I walk around being obsessed with nuclear all day or talking about it, but it's just because it inspires me and makes me think that we can solve these problems with human ingenuity and technology, and that, everyone has a voice in it. I'm not an engineer. I wasn't good at math. I got a C, but I think I have the ability as just a person who cares to do what I can to educate others. And that's the point we should all have. And especially engineers, you have a super important job to do because you are needed for getting to our next advancements in technology, of course, but you also have this voice to talk to people in a way that they understand. If you can translate down all of those complex equations into digestible little nuggets, and you're going to be creating the technologies that are going to save us. So I hope that's inspiring to people. I don't know, but
all right.
Anyway, so my Twitter handle is Tiemann Amelia. So TIEMANN AMELIA. I think you have it.
Yeah, let me put that one up. All right.
Yeah, actually, shameless plug.
No,
here.
Go ahead. Plug away.
I started a little nuclear merch shop with some art designs on Redbubble. So I can send you, how about I just send you the link? I'll stop reading things out. I like doing digital art in my free time, so I decided to make some nuclear themed merch that you can buy as stickers or t-shirts, because there's this cool site where you can get that.
All right, let me pull that up.
If anyone wants a sticker of an atom or a t-shirt.
All right, let me.
There's more to come.
So I will post that in a moment. It's on a different computer than I have two separate computers that I'm running for this.
No worries. I appreciate you.
Yeah, but I really appreciate your time. Thanks for stopping by. I'll connect with you a little bit later as well with any follow-up questions that I get, or also with some stuff that I do, because I've done some work. I've started teaching some classes because I've been also concerned about climate change. So I've been teaching. I stole a class from Berkeley, Physics for Future Presidents, that I'm teaching at my university, and I'm also teaching a class right now on sustainable energy, where we've gone into basically everything. We just did wave energy, and
cool.
when you run the calculations, you get to see, well, really like where the real possibilities lie. You find that a lot of, because there's always a danger, I think, when there are a lot of options out there to deliver some energy, like, oh, tidal power and wave power, and we got wind and solar, and we got geothermal and hydroelectric, and all of these things combined together, and it sounds like it should be enough. But in many cases, when you do the math, you find out that it would take, well, for example, we figured out that with wave energy, you would essentially have to have wave power stations all along the coast of California, like the entire length of California, to get a gigawatt, which is like one power plant. And so because the energy is so diffuse, you end up having to have a huge amount of infrastructure to collect it over such a broad area. And so it's at those kinds of situations when you're like, oh, this is why, it's one thing to just throw these ideas out there, but when they all add up only a little bit at a time, until you can deliver a gigawatt, you're not really in the game. And so
it must be stressful to find out how much wasted energy and heat there is, with the calculations.
Well, waste is always a part of it. So if you just come in with it, if you can get over 25%, then you're in the ballpark. If you can get over 30%, then you're good. And if you can get over 50%, then you feel like really proud of yourself. And so that's one of the advantages.
Better than what we're doing now.
Because one of the advantages you get from the next generation of nuclear plants is because they operate at higher temperatures, you go from basically 35% efficient up to 55% efficient, or almost 60% efficient. So not only do you get even if you use the same amount of fuel, you're getting twice the amount of electricity out of it because you're operating at higher temperatures. And then when you can use more fuel, like a larger fraction of the fuel, because of the way that you reprocess it real time with say a molten salt reactor or something. So there's a lot of those kinds of details that we've gone over in this class. But I think one of the things that been enlightening to a lot of the students is, one, that they can actually do the calculations, that it's not, it's a fairly straightforward calculation once you know, like, okay, here's how we need to plug the numbers into this formula. But it can be, there's a little bit of a danger when people start throwing out lots of options, that if all those options are really small, then you're not going to deliver. If you can't deliver a gigabyte with it, then you're not even you're in the noise. You're so deep in the noise for the electric grid that it's a kind of a non-starter. So anyways,
that's really illuminating.
Yeah. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure to meet you and to get to know your work. We look forward to seeing what comes out of it.
It's been so nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for having me on. It's really fun to chat with you.
You're welcome.